Welcome to this exciting series of lessons entitled The Lord's Prayer, a master guide to confident living. Relax and let Jack Boland inspire you to make your life everything that you want it to be.
This is the first of 4 lessons on the Lord's Prayer. Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist, wrote something once that may be one of the most remarkable statements that I have ever read. Listen to what he said. Among all my patients in the second half of their life, every one of them fell ill because he had lost what the living religions of every age have given their followers. And none of these patients has been really healed who did not regain his religious outlook. Isn't that an incredible statement for an eminent psychiatrist? But not too remarkable, because Dr. Carl Jung had his own in-depth spiritual experience or awakening. This is not generally known, but it seems to be a fact. And because he did, his concept of psychiatry changed. The science of the mind, as he understood that science and practiced it with his patients, thereafter was designed to move them forward or upward into a dimension of themselves that they had not theretofore suspected or experienced. You see, with psychiatry, Dr. Jung was attempting to do, and often succeeded in accomplishing with his patients, the thing that religion has been commissioned or ordained to do with its members. But religion has somehow lost its thrust or understanding throughout the years, throughout the centuries. Prayer is a process in which the mind moves upward, if one could say that the mind can move upward, but moves within itself into places in itself that it had not heretofore seen or experienced, or perhaps had experienced momentarily. All of us have suspected. As a matter of fact, we've had moments in which we have known that there was more to us than the world had seen. We've had our higher moments, and those higher moments have come from our higher self experiencing itself. Prayer, therefore, is the process in which that upward movement takes place. And that upward movement is our purpose for being here on this planet, and more than just a purpose. It is not a sensationless or meaningless purpose. It is the super bonum, the super good. Those who seek to experience this fulfillment are the blessed, because their lives are filled with joy and peace, wisdom and understanding. Their lives are changed because they're changed. They can stand in the same spot and live on a different earth. They can look through the same eyes and behold a uniquely new universe. That's what prayer, real prayer, is about. Prayer is not a poor miserable sinner falling down on his or her knees and crying out for a new muffler on the family car. Prayer is the expansion of the spirit, of the mind, of the soul, of a person. And in that expansion, old things, the old shell, the chrysalis breaks and falls away, and a new self emerges, and that new self encompasses all the things that the Father has planned. That's what prayer is. It is breaking loose of our comfort zone. But prayer to be effective must be meaningful. It must be so designed that your inner mind grasps the full intent and purpose of the prayer and is so moved by your deeply expressed thought and feeling that the highest centers of your being are touched, and the creative power of force that has formed the universe begins to form a new universe within yourself as its self. Prayer, when properly understood and practiced, is the most exciting and rewarding activity that the human mind can experience. And prayer always works. It cannot fail, because real prayer is a science of the mind. No wonder our prayers don't work, because we have not prayed correctly. We have often prayed asking God to come and join us in the mud puddle in which we stood at the moment. Have you never done that? Have you never asked infinite intelligence to come and join you in your misery? Making you less miserable? Was that prayer answered? I don't think so. It can never be answered. And in the Lord's Prayer, we'll find out why that prayer cannot be answered. Miracles do not happen to miserable people. Miracles happen to formerly miserable people. Formerly may have been a fraction of a second ago, but in the moment that we surrender our suffering, our misery, our anxiety, our fear, our apprehension, then something larger can happen to us as a process, and that's what prayer is. It's so interesting that Jesus, the master demonstrator of prayer and the great teacher of prayer, spoke the Aramaic language, and that language only had about perhaps 600 words or symbols. And the word for prayer was slopa, which means to array or to lay out. It also means to set a trap. In prayer, we use the mind to set a trap for God. Perhaps you never thought of prayer in that way, that in prayer you're setting a trap for God. That's what the Aramaic language, that's what the symbology was. Now this, of course, did not mean that you would snare God when God came along, because God was already there, but it was seeing the mind as the place in which one would experience the presence of God. Can you not therefore see why so many of our prayers have not been answered? Because we saw ourselves as being here and God being there, and we were praying to an unseen and an unknown God at some distance. That kind of prayer never works. Praying to a distant God. You know why it doesn't work? Because there is no distant God. How can it work? The God that we pray to is within us. And Jesus, the master teacher of prayer, said that you can search for him, lo here and lo there, but you will not find him. You will not experience God until we look within ourselves. And it's very important to know that within one's own self is where this activity takes place. The demonstration will most certainly be made, at least in part, in what appears to be the external world, the world outside our physical and apparently our spiritual self. But when we begin to understand how we connect with each other and with Spirit, we will discover that even things that happen at a distance are not external to our spiritual influence. Prayer is an act or state of mind, and is therefore subject to the laws that govern mind. And prayer rises in purity and power in proportion to the spirituality of our conception of God and his relationship to our being. And what that means is that if we feel ourselves separated, then we will have the experience of separation and the accompanying need to expand energy to jump the gap of a spark. And if we feel ourselves unworthy, then we will experience not the answer that we seek, but only the unworthiness that we felt. That's why the Lord's Prayer is so absolutely vital. It is more than a prayer. It is a process that teaches us how to reshape, reform our state of mind in the midst of any situation. Jesus gave an example of prayer in its highest form when, in the Sermon on the Mount, he created and gave to the world this system, this process. And it was constructed by Jesus with certain very clear ends in view, and that's why that of all his teachings, it is by far the best known and the most often quoted, and indeed is the one common denominator of all the Christian churches. It's the one thing that they all use in common and never argue about. They argue about everything else. Never, ever about the Lord's Prayer. They've not tried to change it. They just keep reciting it. Now, most of us have been taught to recite the Lord's Prayer, but we were probably never taught to pray the Lord's Prayer. And to recite the Lord's Prayer is not the same as praying it. And while it is a true prayer and one can recite it or pray it, it is still more than just that prayer. It is a statement of being. And I'll try to explain that as we spend this time together, these next few moments. Remember, though, when the master teacher was telling us about vain repetitions, he really was telling us that when we speak a word, we need to know what that word means. We need to visualize what that word means. Have you, in conversation, found yourself saying some things that you really didn't understand or know? And almost invariably when you do, then you'll fake it, won't you? You'll hide it and you'll cover it. Very important when we're praying that we know what the words mean. Because words really are nothing of themselves except they are symbols of thoughts and feelings. And so the word does not have the power. It is the mind symbol. It is the belief that's in the mind and the feeling that joins the word that has the power. For example, I could say to you, I love you, and be thinking about going after a loaf of bread. Have you ever not had someone tell you that they loved you and you wondered, what were you thinking when you said that? I did not feel it. It's the feeling. The sense of love must be given words. And so we have chosen a word, love, but it is the feeling that has the power. So it is the Lord's Prayer when we're using prayer. Now remember that this prayer is designed to change your soul state in any given moment and to lift you out of any negative or dark place in which you have found yourself, but to move you up into a higher experience from which you do not have to return if you do not desire. It is impossible to understand prayer unless we have come to believe that there is another dimension of mind or of self within us all. Until we can begin to understand that we have been living and thinking, believing ourselves to be three-dimensional, purely human persons. And the reality is that we are more than three-dimensional persons. That there's another dimension to ourselves, a dimension in which God's own wisdom and power and love flow through us, not as some strange, abnormal experience, but as the most natural of all experiences, an experience in which we are empowered from on high to see, to observe, to understand, to know things that we did not know a moment before. Prayer is the process of becoming so dramatically changed within one's own beingness that the whole world is transformed for us. You can stand in the same spot and live on a different earth. You can look through the same eyes and see a different universe. The mind that a moment before was an expert at creating problems becomes a miracle working expression of the Spirit of holiness. And until you and I come to believe that this is the kind of creation that we are, each of us, not just another person who lived a long time ago, but that we are that person. We are that person. This is why Jesus gave the formula. He gave a formula that would permit anyone who would believe what he believed to have the experience that he was having and to do the things that he was doing, to have the insights and the wisdom that caused him to make the choices that he made. He never said, worship me. He said, believe what I believe. Believe what I believe. If you believe what I believe, then the things that I do, oh, you will do them even greater things than that. The most wonderful things. If you will change your belief system. And so prayer is this process, a series of steps, not just words. You see, the Lord's Prayer is a series of 7 steps or movements upward in consciousness. Not just words. There is like step 1, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight. The first step or the first movement upward. And then we take the next step and the next step. It is an ascension of being in which we are transformed, in which we rise above the old things and we're moved into higher things. Have you noticed in your life when nothing seems to be working out, you tried everything that you knew to try, and it all seems to be in vain, and you have you've prayed and you've cried and you've accused and you've blamed and you have felt sorry for yourself, said, how could this happen to a wonderful person like me? When there was nothing else to do or to think or to say, you just quit. You ever had that experience? I've had it. Everybody who's had that experience, raise your hand. Was not that always a turning point in your life? Invariably, it's a turning point in your life. Something happens that did not happen a moment before. That step is usually at about the 6th or the 7th step. It is the point in which one moves out of the present octave and into the following octave. You see, the Lord's Prayer is based on the law of the octaves. Just the same principle that music is made possible by. 7 notes. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, the 7th note. And when you hit the 8th note, what happens? You're in the next octave, aren't you? Well, do you see how that progression with music? Your suffering is about la, ti, only about there. Okay? That's when you're so miserable you can hardly stand it. And when the surrendering comes, then do, pow, you're off again into another octave, into another expression. You can understand about the days of the week. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Suffering. Saturday. Miserable. Sunday. Starting all over again, right? Well, that's not an exact corollary, but we're dealing with that same progression in consciousness upward. And let me say this, it is not necessary to become really miserable to learn how to pray. Most of us have insisted on that process, but it is not necessary. And I point that out to you that if you're doing quite well this evening or this week, then you can stay right where you are. You do not have to descend to the valley of the shadow of darkness to overcome. There's within all nature an urge, a need to return to its source, to seek a conscious contact with its creator. We can see that everywhere that we look. Every living thing is bursting out of its present form, out of its present comfort zone. You'll see it in the spring. There appears to be death or no life. And then the process continues, and suddenly there's a bursting forth, and it is spring, and the grass becomes green overnight. And the tree that had no leaves is suddenly alive. And that same process is seeking to happen in each one of us. And when we truly understand the nature of prayer, then we can cooperate with the process rather than to resist this urge upward. You cannot have the urge except it is placed in you by the spirit of wholeness. You could not dream your dreams unless they were put within your own mind by a larger mind. You could not seek your good unless it was there, any more than you can find it by yourself, even though it is there. And prayer is that process that permits us to grow, to expand, and to become. And I'm not just talking now about the prayer that we pray when we're desperate, although that prayer can be the most important of all because it bursts us open again. But I'm talking about a process that one works with continuously, understanding what one is doing. See, if all that I do is to pray the Lord's Prayer 14 times a day for the rest of my life, not understanding what's happening, then nothing will happen. But if I see it as a process, I can reproduce it without really saying one word of the prayer itself. You'll understand that better as we move through this process. Your mind, my mind, cannot rest until they're one with the mind of God, with the supermind from which our minds have sprung, and in whose presence we always are. And so this great prayer, the Lord's Prayer, was given to us as a formula, as a key that will unlock the door of consciousness, and with which we can be transformed from three-dimensional to fourth-dimensional persons, in which we can enter into a state of mind from which we never need to descend unless we choose to do so. Before we, though, consider the first clause or movement of the great prayer, I'm going to ask you to forget that you have ever learned it, that you've ever heard it, that you've ever spoken it, that you've ever prayed it. And the reason I'm going to ask you to do that is that, and I'm going to try to do the same thing myself. You see, if we think we've done something, we think we know it, then we can't learn very much about it, can we? Have you ever had someone to try to tell you something about one of your little pet projects, and the mind says, no, wait a minute, now it's my turn to speak. I want you to not so much hear my words, but to hear the movement of your own mind, the understanding that is already there, the wisdom that would speak to you, that would lift you up within yourself, the mind that is your own beloved higher self, that part of you that is so difficult to define to the intellect that we've had to come up with symbols, with metaphors, because the intellect cannot understand such holy or wholesome or high things. The intellect is of our lower self primarily and cannot reach as high as we choose to go. If we understood what our Father means, and that's the first movement of the Lord's Prayer, we would find that it's a complete system of theology in itself. If we could get this statement fixed clearly in our minds and our consciousness, we would therefore understand the nature of God, the nature of ourselves in relationship to God, and the nature of our relationship with each other. And from that understanding, there would never again be an argument between us, or a misunderstanding, or fear that one or the other of us might somehow impose him or herself upon the rest of us. If we really understood what our Father means. Let's explore it, see what possibilities exist. But first, let's remember that until the time of Jesus, the deity had mostly been described as a kind of oriental despot, a relentless, sometimes cruel and angry, punishing God, a God to be afraid of. a God that people felt they needed to appease, and in order to appease God, you had to make sacrifices, living sacrifices. You had to go and put things upon the altar, even making living human sacrifices in some cultures, because God was an angry God, and God needed God's pound of flesh. Jesus did an incredible thing in laying aside the concept of an angry, ugly, non-loving God for all time. As a matter of fact, what he did was so brave that it was partially why he was crucified. He not only dared to say that God was love, but he went a giant step further and said that God was in him and in every person. The world was not ready to hear such high wisdom. You think times have changed in 2,000 years? The world is still not ready to hear such high wisdom. As a matter of fact, you may not be ready to hear such high wisdom. Check it out. You may not really be ready to believe that the whole Spirit of God is in you, and you are not only worthy of it, but you have no choice but to have the experience. You are an individualized expression of that Spirit. Jesus was not establishing a new religion, and he was not going against the religion of his time. He was trying to bring, and he did bring, the awareness of his state of mind into focus in the world of the people of his time. And it was a very difficult thing for him to do, because it's hard to talk about these higher things using the language of the world. You see, we have assigned to the words of our language certain meanings. A few moments ago, I used the word love. And when we say love, what do you think? I love you, you love me. I love some of you more than some of you love me. That's what the mind thinks. And I love some of you more than I love others, the intellect thinks. But that's not the kind of love that Jesus was talking about. He was talking about a love that is so far above our human ability to experience that we don't have words for it. There are no words to talk about the love that God has for us. There are no words to talk about the love that a fourth-dimensional person has for a three-dimensional being. In that love, there's no criticism. There's no rejection. There's no guilt. Nor is there any jealousy. See, our love means, I love you so much, you do not look in the direction of someone else. The love that we experience is often threatened. But you cannot threaten the love of God that is flowing through us, or the love that God has for us. And so can you see that in order to change this concept that God was an angry person who caused the floods to come, and the famines to be there, and the drought, and all the things and caused the death of small children? He said, no, God is love. But what metaphor could he use to describe that love? Remember, though, that he taught and lived in a patriarchal society, a social order in which the father is the head of the household, and in which descent and succession are traced on the male side. The identity was on the male side of the family, and possessions were on the male side of the family. And our word communion, which means possession in common, was not the order of the day in that time. So he chose as a symbol, a metaphor, the parent-child relationship at its highest form at that time, and that was the relationship between the male parent and the son. The male parent and the son. Now, the male parent and the older son was fully established. Everyone knew about that relationship. What the father had passed to the male son at his death, to the older son. All that the father had belonged to the older son. And more than that, the older son, this represented a relationship of a higher to a lower order. The father reaching down to the son. But there was progression, the son moving upward, and in time becoming more and more like the father, and ultimately becoming the father himself. having the possessions and passing them downward too. So we're looking at a progression and a movement, not a static relationship between a dictator and a subject. We're looking at a feeling relationship that was fully established in the minds of the people at that time. Now, he chose to go a step further, and in the story that I want to share with you in just a moment, and use the story of the second son, the younger son, who's not supposed to receive all that much love. You see, all of the goods went to the older kid, right? Well, let me tell you what happened to the younger kid, in case you have felt like a second-class citizen. And I suspect you have. You remember the story that was in the 15th chapter of Luke, the prodigal. The prodigal son. The prodigal person is really what it should be, because the male sex has had no market on being the prodigal. We have all been equally screwed up. Would you agree? There's no difference in us. And we are all equally participants in all that the Father has. So, the younger, being the less wise of those sons, had been listening very carefully to his father, and he said, I really don't like it around here. It's not exciting at all. I've heard all of this stuff all of my life. I'm going to ask my father for that which is rightfully mine, and I'm going out and do my own thing. And so he went to his father, and to his amazement, his father gave him his portion of the goods that were his. And can you imagine the smile that was on his face? Wowee. And he took himself into a far country. And I have heard speakers like me say, it must have been Mesopotamia. Or it must have been what is now Arabia. No, the far country is the same far country that you and I have been to. He took himself into his own ego. He didn't have to leave town to go into a far country. He could stay right where he was and be in that far country. Didn't have to leave home, really, to be in the far country. And he, in time, spent or lost everything that he had on riotous living. In other words, he lived a disordered life. He was not practicing principles. He had no sense of self. He had, well, in our language we might say he had low self-esteem. He thought that he could achieve what he wanted in life by buying, by possessing, by owning, by controlling, perhaps, or by just getting out of town. Some of us have tried that. And in time, the most wonderful thing happened to him. It has happened to many of us. When he had spent everything, a great famine arose in that country. So he went and joined himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed the swine. And he would gladly have fed on the pods that the swine ate. In other words, he didn't even get to eat with the pigs. He ate what the swine left. And I point that out to you because that's really hitting at the bottom. You just can't go much lower than that. A Jewish boy. Not even being able to eat with the pigs. Got the picture? Now listen to this line. And no one gave him anything. At the human level, there was no response. He was wiped out. He was lost. The answers that he sought were not there. And he could not find his solution at the human level. As long as you believe that there's one more romance that you can try that will fix you, that there's one more person, you haven't met him or her yet, but you know they're there, and when you find them, then you will be happy again. As long as you believe that all you have to do is to move to Southern California, and you'll find the answers there. You won't. You'll still be in the far country. And you will discover that no person can give you anything. It's not until we stop looking in that world, in that dimension. And now these remarkable words. And when he came to himself, in that moment of shock, in that moment of truth, you have had a moment of truth in your life, or you would not be sitting here listening to my voice. You did not come through those doors or turn on that cassette player unless you've had a moment of truth. You've had it. A moment in which you wondered, is this all there is? A moment in which you thought, surely I am insane. Or a moment in which you knew that you would rather die than live one more day the way you were. No longer the way your life was, the way you were. See, as long as we think that our problems are in our world, we haven't had the moment of truth. It's when we come to know that I am the problem. And when he came to himself, he remembered that there was another state of mind, another state of being. The Bible calls it his father's house. And that even the hired hands, the servants there, lived better than he. And so he made a very wise decision. He said, I will arise and go to my father. And I'll get honest with him. I'll tell him that I've sinned, meaning I've missed the mark. That's all it means. I've fallen short. I thought I could do it, but I couldn't. I thought I could make it, but I didn't. Do you know how difficult that is? That is the most difficult moment of our lives. Some people would rather die than take that step. I almost took my life rather than take that step. It is a moment of a new reality. And when we take it, then that's when we go into action. When we get honest with ourselves as never before. And that's what happened to him. And while he was yet at a distance, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned. In other words, the son admitted his mistakes. But the admission of his mistakes was not falling down upon his knees and reaching upward and saying, I'm a poor miserable sinner. It was just the freedom that comes when we can honestly look at ourselves and appraise ourselves, when it's the moment of the reduction of the ego. It's the moment when the seed bursts open and the new growth within begins to emerge and move toward the light. From the beginning of the existence of man on this planet, there has never been one time when a human being has had this movement within toward the light or toward God, a moment of surrendering, that there was not an immediate response. And that's what the story says. His father saw him and had compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. The trip back home is not in a Greyhound bus. It's that quickly within ourselves. And the response is not over a long period of time. It is instantaneous. The result of that movement between man and woman and God will last for a lifetime. And that relationship, that coming together, can happen and should happen 1,000 times, 10,000 times in your lifetime and mine. We should have this experience every day, perhaps 100 times a day. There's no reason why we cannot have this experience in every experience that we have, if we can but admit our personal powerlessness and come to ourselves and return or move toward the Spirit within us. Then we become empowered. Empowered, listen. If you read the story, you discover that the response from the father was absolutely unbelievable. There was no blame, there was joy. The father came out to meet him and turned to the servants, meaning the universal powers, and said, quick, put a robe around his shoulders. My son is weary from this long travel. Shoes on his feet. He has walked a long distance over sharp stones. A ring on his finger symbolizing a new consciousness, a new awareness. and go and kill the fatted calf, and let us eat and drink and be merry. Meaning, let's have fun. The spiritual life is fun. It is joy. When you and I have this experience that the Lord's Prayer moves us into, there is a divine ecstasy that is there. The feeling is joy above joy. 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 That's what the prodigal story is about. Joy. Peace. Oneness. Solutions. When you read the story, you begin to discover, to see that it was not the Father that came, it was the feminine presence of God that comes to meet us and to greet us. And that is the miracle of the Our Father that Jesus was giving to us, telling the people of his time and the people of this time that God, our Father, is not a male being, but a spirit of life, a responsive expression of our Creator. Always with us. Before we have asked, the answer is there. And the sweet, sweet Spirit of God nurtures and cares and counsels. And God cannot possibly forgive us because God has never blamed us. Do you think that the Father did not know that the prodigal would return? Of course. Do you think that the Father did not know that the child would screw up? Of course. Where have we conceived of a parent that would cast a child into a burning place forever? Jesus said, you who are parents and who are so imperfect, yet you love your children so very much. Let me ask you, would you take a small child who disobeyed you for a moment and place her hand against a red-hot stove and hold it there until she screamed and cried in agony and said, I will do as you ask? Would you do that? Those are the kinds of stories that make newspaper headlines. There's not one person here that can conceive of that happening. And yet, our religious history is full of a tradition and of a dogma and creedal statements that have told us that our God was a punishing God who would throw not one child, but millions, billions of us into a burning place because we did not believe what we could not believe. Jesus Christ is saying, it is not so. Let me show you. Our Father, the Spirit of love, who cares, who is, who knows, who feels, who touches you this very moment. Do you believe it? Do you feel it? Then for you, that's the way it really is. God bless you.
This program is continued on the opposite side.